Stoicism and Objectivism, two distinct philosophies with a shared connection to the rationalist tradition. They both cherish reality and they recognize the validity of emotion, but treat the passions with suspicion and as unwieldy forces that need some direction or discipline. Both philosophies care deeply about personal responsibility and civic virtue, but in different ways. Objectivists follow in the footsteps of Ayn Rand, and they have had plenty of time to criticize Stoicism, and they have. Rarely has a modern advocate of the Stoic philosophy been present to respond and speak for the belief systems of Aurelius, Seneca, Epictetus, and Zeno. I'm Stephen Kent of Geeky Stoics, so I'm only somewhat biased in moderating here Ryan Holiday of the Daily Stoic, author of at least 14 excellent books, and Daniel Richards, executive director of the Prometheus Foundation, a cheerful and creative champion for objectivism. Gentlemen, let's begin with freedom. That's why we're all here in Palm Springs. This is Freedom Fest, and both of you believe strongly in the broad concept of the need for freedom. But I imagine that you have different opinions about what its essence is and what freedom is for. Ryan, what is freedom and why do we actually need to have it?
I think it was Eisenhower. He had a line about how freedom is better defined as the opportunity for self-discipline, which I think is probably somewhere close to the Stoic view of freedom. Just because something is allowed doesn't mean one should. And so I think what I love about Stoicism, why I think it's been helpful, and why I think it's actually more relevant in a world today where we have, freedoms that the ancients couldn't have dreamed of, is that we now have this greater responsibility for self-discipline and self-control. I think about someone like Marcus Aurelius. In one sense, you could say he's the freest man in the world. One of the friends of the Emperor Hadrian gets in an argument with Hadrian, and Hadrian says, "No, I think you're wrong." And then the philosopher says, "Yeah, you're right." And his friends sort of admonish him, and he says, "The man with 40 legions is always right." And so, the idea for Marcus Aurelius is he really can do anything he wants, and we see some of the almost incomprehensible excesses of the other Roman emperors. So, what keeps Marcus Aurelius in check? What is the counterbalance to his unlimited freedom? It's ultimately philosophy. It's this sense that just because you can doesn't mean you should, and just because you want to doesn't mean you'll actually want to have done it later. So, I don't know if that exactly answers your question. Freedom is important. Liberty is essential. I would just argue that the countervailing force has to be this sense of self-mastery or self-control.
Daniel, same question to you, and y'all feel free to kick it back and forth, but what is freedom in the objectivist viewpoint, and what is it for?
Yeah, so I think objectivism starts by saying free from what? Freedom. What are we talking about here with freedom? And for Ayn Rand and objectivists, it's freedom from coercion, but a particular type of coercion. Force, someone literally forcing me to do something, or fraud, someone tricking me into doing something and then keeping a value from me. But why? Why is this important for objectivists? It's important because every single person in this room is an individual. You must use your mind to get through your day, to achieve your values, to build a wonderful, happy, productive, successful, joyful life. And every time restrictions are put on that by the state or by other individuals, they're lessening your ability to use your mind to build a wonderful life. And that is why we need freedom. And I think Ryan's answer was super eloquent. Man, it's a privilege to be on stage with you. But I think his framing of things actually starts to get at the distinction I see between Stoicism and Objectivism, with the framing being that it is about this self-discipline, sort of this restriction, like pulling back, right? And I think that at least the framing that I like to use with Objectivism is about, it's about going forward. It's about building this masterful, beautiful life. It's about wringing every ounce of joy and happiness out of your existence on this planet. So it's a good place to start.
There's actually an interesting passage in the beginning of Meditations where Marcus Aurelius thanks most of his intellectual influences and mentors. And he says he learns from the Stoics. He names most of the members of the Stoic opposition. He says he learned the importance of a society governed by equality of status, freedom of speech, and he says above all of leaders who respect the liberty of their subjects. So I think we're probably more or less on the same page. I think the Stoics would just say, hey, sometimes you think getting to do everything you want to do is going to be freedom. But when you actually look at people who do the first thing that pops into their head, who do everything they want to do, who have no self-imposed restraints, those actually become the least free of people. I think it's interesting. Epictetus is a slave in Nero's court. He's owned by Nero's secretary. And so there's this interesting contrast where you have a man who is, literally deprived of his freedom. But he looks around at these rich people, these addicted people, these ambitious people. We're told this one scene where he watches a wealthy Roman sucking up to Nero's shoe cobbler because he wants to curry favor with Nero. And I think Epictetus, he doesn't say this exactly, but I think he goes, I'm actually a lot freer than that guy. Like, no one is more a slave than somebody who is sucking up to somebody else to bounce shot favor, and I think there is this interesting dichotomy that Epictetus is legally unfree, but emotionally, physically, spiritually free in a way that few of us manage to get to. And I just think that's the Stoic conception is like, obviously freedom is good, obviously legal protections and all this is, that's the domain of civil and political society. But on the individual level, to some degree, these things are irrelevant because we have to have freedom within ourselves and freedom from, the chaos and disorder that unfettered freedom can also bring about.
And so this is why Objectivism puts a big emphasis on being a systematic philosophy, right? We don't start with politics in Objectivism. We don't say capitalism, and therefore we should live a rational life, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We start with the basics of the universe, what we can know about reality and how we can know things about reality. And because of that, we then go on to, well, who am I? And what should I do in the world? And what should I be as a person in this world? And then from there, we say, how do I maximize that? Through freedom, through laissez-faire capitalism, through as few limits on what I can choose to do as possible. And so I actually mostly agree with Ryan on this point. Objectivism doesn't say, go do anything you want. No, there are many things that you could do that are highly self-destructive. Objectivism says a man's life is the standard of value, and your life in particular is your highest moral purpose. And with that in mind, what kinds of things would you choose to do? You would choose to do great things for yourself. You would choose to do wonderful things, build fantastic careers, and find the most passionate lover you could possibly find, and go out and go to the best comedy shows like Adam Carolla that we saw here at Freedom Fest, right? Like, we wouldn't do base things we wouldn't eat cupcakes all day.
Sure.
Because that's not treating ourselves. If we are the highest moral purpose of our life, we wouldn't do those self-destructive things, or at least we shouldn't.
Does Objectivism have a framework, though, for like, well, let's just take the cupcakes and eating those all day, for saying that if you harm yourself in this way, that is not good for you. It's not enhancing your happiness, but it actually also happens to be bad for the people around you. We're talking about the circles of concern on the main stage. It might be bad for your family. It could be bad for your community.
The healthcare system.
Is that also sort of a thing that Objectivism is able to speak to, or you kind of wave that one away and go, as long as it's bad for the person, that's why we determine it's bad?
Well, as an Objectivist, I won't waive anything. I will take any opportunity to sit in front of a microphone and talk to you. But I think Objectivism says it starts with you and your values, right? And, Ayn Rand said philanthropy, charity, those things aren't bad in Objectivism, but they're also just not positive values in Objectivism. They're sort of neutral based on what your hierarchy of values are, what your hierarchy is, what those values are for you. And if at one point you are finding yourself nearly destitute and having a hard time finding a job and you need food, is it a moral good to give away your last dollar to a charity? Objectivism would say, no, of course it's not. So it's not I have no issue with the chart that Ryan put up about the circles of concern, but I would say that in objectivism, we decide the layers of those circles and what we're going to do in those circles based on what type of life, what type of long-term, rationally self-interested life we are trying to build for ourselves.
Absolutely. So to follow the determinism and sort of freedom element, so the issue of determinism, free will and agency, comes up a lot with critiques of Stoicism. You might be tired of hearing about them at this point. But the idea that events or a fate is preordained sort of requires sort of a spiritual element of thinking, the fate, leaving us with Epictetus's two handles. We only have the option of how we respond to those things. That has led some objectivists, on AynRand.org in particular, to say that Stoicism demands that we voluntarily accept our leash and accommodate ourselves to the inevitable. Ryan, I know you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, there's a famous Stoic metaphor that we're dogs tied to a cart. And the cart's going where it's going, and we can choose to lay down and be dragged, or we can sort of cheerfully trot alongside. I think you see this in recovery, right? The acceptance of the higher power sometimes trips people up. Is it so much an argument for the existence of God? I would say it works as a step in recovery because one of the first steps to a good life is accepting that you are not God, that the universe does not revolve around you, that it is largely indifferent to you, and that there are vastly more things outside of your control than in your control. And so, yeah, there is sometimes this sense that Stoicism is passive and resigned and apathetic. When I look at the lives of the Stoics, though, I don't really see resigned or apathetic people. I see people who make great works of art, people who had families, people who built businesses, people who ran for office, people who did, things that we are still talking about today.
I highlighted the passage that in Lives of the Stoics, that they were never simply resigned to the current state of things. They bled and died for change.
Yeah, I mean, as I said in my talk, they were literally revolutionaries and inspired generations of revolutionaries. So I think that's an important distinction between sometimes the way we interpret the things and then how the Stoics themselves interpreted it practically as to how they lived their lives. To me, the understanding that we don't control what happens, but we control how we respond to what happens is actually a statement of agency, is a statement of optimism and hope, and leads to the creation of things. It's just also rooted, I think, in a just sort of fundamental acceptance of existence.
Yeah, I think this is a key distinction, and again, sometimes it's difficult to tell if there's a difference in framing and rhetoric of what we're talking about, or if there's a clear distinction in the philosophical truths that we're talking about. But when I read the parable about the dog tied to the cart, this fiery part of my objectivist righteous indignation said, tear down the damn cart and build your own, and go at your own pace, right? And so objectivism does essentially agree that you are not God. Your will does not create the world. The world is as it is. Reality is as it is. And you have to accept the facts of reality. But objectivism definitely says there are way more things in your control than there are things out of your control. And you should not be totally resigned and accept what happens to you and then respond to it. And that is perhaps one of the major things that turns me off about Stoicism, is it does seem so much about response to things. And sometimes that's necessary. There are hardships in life. And resiliency is a good thing. People will die. You will lose things. That is going to happen. But objectivism says these are the vast minority of instances. In most cases, you are living a life that you build. You are going to live the life that you choose to live, ultimately. And loss, unhappiness, these should be considered temporary and fleeting, and bring you back to that purposeful joy that you are trying to achieve in your life.
I guess it's an interesting question as to what constitutes most of the things, or maybe it's like we're looking at a jar, and what are the big rocks and what are the little rocks that fill it up. It's like, look, we don't control gravity, we don't control when we were born, we don't control where we were born, or how tall we're going to be, or we don't control who our parents are. We don't control. There's so many. Like, are we responding to the big things or are we, moving the little things? I think that's kind of an interesting question, and it probably gets at some level to semantics. But I'll take the criticism of the Stoics, and I've leveraged. I have expressed it myself, which is that when you look at Roman society 2,000 years ago, which obviously most of the Stoics were a product of, they didn't believe in, meritocracy so much. They didn't believe in human agency. Like Marcus Aurelius is basically selected to be emperor against his will. At no part does he consider, I don't have to do this. I only have one life. I could do something else. It's interesting to think that, some of our conceptions of what is possible and isn't possible politically, economically, creatively, culturally, lifestyle, these were the hard-won inventions of, that famous quote about how progress depends on the unreasonable man. There is a reasonableness to Stoicism that says, hey, this is how it is. This is how it's always been. Accept it. What I like about the founders is they are steeped in Stoicism, and yet they go, we can start a new government from nothing, and so the idea that in practice the Stoics were super resigned, I don't think is totally true, but they were products of a time and place in the same way that war and terrorism were the only options before the invention of civil disobedience, right? And we are the lucky beneficiaries of all sorts of technologies. I don't think we sometimes see these cultural things as technologies, but they were. And the Stoics didn't have access to them, and I would like to think they would update their assumptions in light of them now. We don't know.
Sure.
But it's kind of hard to be arguing with someone who's been dead for 2,500 years. And when you have so much more information than they could have possibly ever had.
AI will help us.
Yeah, sure.
But just one quick point on the jar of rocks and the big rocks versus the little rocks, right? It's interesting to me because objectivism certainly says you have to accept gravity, right? Unless you are the inventor of the airplane, right? Now you have to accept the laws of aerodynamics, that's for sure, unless you are inventing a rocket. And now you have to accept the laws of rocketry or whatever it is, right?
But if you're delusionally denying the existence of gravity, you're not going to be able to successfully... So yeah.
That's correct.
Yes.
But the point I want to make about that is, yes, there are, quote, big things that you have to accept about the way the world is. Metaphysical mountains. I cannot move these things. I can do nothing about them. But the things that give me the most pleasure, the things that allow me to live a life that is worthy of living, are things like getting to choose the person I fall in love with and spend the rest of my life with, deciding to have children, the work that I do every single day. These are the things that to me are the, quote, big things that make up the moments that make my life worth living.
No, I think that's right. And I don't necessarily know if accepting is... Actually, I would argue that accepting the facts on the ground are the first step towards potentially changing or transcending them, right? So sometimes I think we think the problem with acceptance is that it's the end of the sentence, right? And it's actually the beginning of the next sentence, right? You have to accept the world where it is, how people are, what's going on, to be able to go, and what I'm going to do about it is X.
Yeah, and that's what I like about objectivism in particular. It says, look before you. What are the materials at your disposal, right? And you can't wish that you had different materials. They just are what they are. But now, build the coolest thing you have ever seen.
Yeah, you can't transcend limitations unless you have a concept that limitations are a thing.
Yes.
So happiness, we're kind of like on the edge here of talking about happiness. Pleasure was mentioned, fulfillment. Happiness is a pretty active pillar of objectivism. It's very clear about that. And Ryan, even Gregory Hayes, in his introduction to Meditations, he acknowledges that he feels that Marcus Aurelius does not have a prescription for the life of happiness or a way to achieve it, only a way of resisting pain. So it's funny, kind of like that critical viewpoint coming in a wonderful translation. Is there a Stoic agenda for happiness that can help people today? And is it a modernized version that just the ancients just didn't require or offer?
It's tough with meditations because we are looking at the private thoughts of someone who would probably be mortified that they were ever published. And so it's hardly a systemic or systematic explanation of what the Stoics thought. And in fact, we don't really have any texts that purport to say, here is what the Stoics think about all these things. We have a tantalizing list, for instance, of the titles of essays that Zeno wrote and Cleanthes wrote and Chrysippus wrote. And then we have smattering of letters from Seneca, a couple of essays. We have some selected notes from Epictetus of his lectures. And then we have Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. And so this gives us a good understanding of what the Stoics thought about a lot of things. But just because they don't specifically say happiness is important and here is the Stoic recipe for happiness, doesn't mean that they didn't think happiness was important and that they didn't strive to be happy. I would suspect that they did. And I've often found, saying that it's just a recipe for avoiding pain. I mean, Marcus Aurelius is a man who loses his father as a young boy. He lives through a pandemic and a flood and wars, and being the emperor would actually be awful. He buries half of his children. I mean, that this guy gets out of bed every morning is not someone who's just resisting pain. It strikes me as someone who has found a reason to live despite everything that happened to him. There's a new edition of Viktor Frankl's essays that came out a few years ago called Yes to Life in Spite of Everything. And I think that is a good encapsulation of the Stoic idea of life and happiness. Is it, smiles and good times? Where those exist, I think it is. But they were, again, as a product of their time and place, I think, looking for a more robust definition of happiness that one could have in all circumstances. When you don't get to choose how you live, what's happening, whether your children survive, you're having to figure out how to. Cicero's question was, can you be happy even when you're being tortured on the rack?
There's that scene described in Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, where he's talking about a boy who is, going to the chambers, and he wanted to die a certain way, and he described his favorite heroes from one of his favorite films before he went into the death camps, and he just wanted to go out like that person because all of his choices and agency were taken away, but he had this one idea of what it meant to die well. It's powerful for a child.
Is that as fun as follow your passions, live, laugh, love, or whatever? No, it's not. But it is the reality of existence for millions of people historically, for millions of people all over the world right now. And by the way, quite easily could be the reality for us. I think the Stoics lived in a time and place where things were not nearly as stable as they appear to be to us now, and they had they were profoundly influenced by that.
My goodness, there's a lot to respond to there. We went from happiness through a journey into the Holocaust,
yes.
And there's a lot to say, so I will try to be super succinct in this. Well, one, I want to say that I do agree that Stoics have the best names of any philosophers. That's without doubt. But so it is unfortunate that we don't have more Stoic text, because it would be interesting to see what they said about other topics, including more on happiness, right? But this is partially what attracts me to Objectivism. Objectivism is a systematic philosophy. Ayn Rand takes incredible care to prove every assertion that she makes all the way down to the metaphysical facts of reality, all the way down to axioms about the world. She takes delicate, intricate logic to do that, and I have not found any contradictions in this logic, which is why I love the system that is Objectivism, right? And so as I read the Stoics, what comes to me in terms of happiness, quote unquote, is being virtuous is happiness, essentially. Like you being virtuous, and that is happiness. And Objectivism says virtue is the means to happiness. You aren't just being virtuous for the sake of being virtuous, and that is the end. You are virtuous so that you can achieve a value in your life. And a value in an Objectivism is something that you actively take action to get or to keep it for yourself. So even if you say something is a value, if I say my family is a value and then I choose to spend no time with them, they're not really a value then. And so that the action part of it is really important, right? Like you have to do something in order to get that value. And happiness then comes from actually achieving your values in the world. That is what happiness ultimately is. Last thing I'll say, and boy, what a delicate topic. But of course, there are millions of people in the world today, and tens of millions, hundreds of millions throughout history, who went through absolutely horrific things, the Holocaust and all sorts of horrible things. Objectivism likes to make a distinction about what it calls emergency situations and then our life, our daily life. And it says, in emergency situations, how do you choose what's right or wrong? And Ayn Rand brings out the lifeboat scenario where two people are on a raft and one of them is going to starve to death unless they eat the other. How do you determine what is right in that scenario? And her response is, I have no idea and neither do you. Because that is an emergency and we don't live our lives in emergencies. The vast majority of our life, not for everyone, but the vast majority of our life for most people is not spent in an emergency. It's spent making normal choices about what to do with your life, where to go, what to eat, who to love, etc. And that is how we should base our morality.
I would also say that's what philosophy should primarily deal with, right? I think the reason most people think philosophy is inaccessible or impractical is that when they do hear of it, it's like, let me tell you what the trolley problem is. And then when you make a choice, let me tell you why you obviously made the wrong choice for all these reasons that you never considered before, right? Or here's how we know whether we're living in a computer simulation or not. Or here's actually why this good thing that you did is actually terrible for the following reasons.
It's so many games.
Yeah, and people just get bogged down and exhausted and they just go, fuck it, I'll just do what feels right. Yeah. And I think if philosophy is designed to help us with the practicalities of existence, how to be a good person, how to live a good life, how not to waste your time, how to find meaning in your work, that's to me what it's about. And I agree. There are not just that there's a bunch of extreme situations, but I think what's fascinating about the Stoics being men and women of action is that we do get to see how they made imperfect decisions in imperfect situations. Seneca being wrongly exiled, and then his ticket back to Rome is that he has to tutor this young boy. The young boy turns out to be Nero. For a time, Nero listens to him, and Rome is relatively peaceful and stable. Nero descends into insanity, and Seneca has to make the same choice that people politically have to make today. Is it better to maintain your access and hopefully at some dire situation be the adult voice in the room, or does one wash their hands of it and say, philosophically, I want no part in this? And I think Seneca makes the right choice and then makes the wrong choice and then makes the right choice and then goes out in the end quite bravely. The point is, none of these things are neat and clean. Kant's experiment about the police knocking at your door asking, you're hiding some person who's being persecuted, and you're supposed to go, well, I shouldn't, if everyone lied, then the whole world would fall apart, so I should never lie, and I'm going to tell the truth. These are not just unlikely situations, but nonsensical situations that I think any reasonable person would make the right choice in. And here we have a philosopher explaining this fucking upside down universe in which honesty is more important than protecting a persecuted individual. And there we go. We wonder why people don't think philosophy is for life.
And on this, we wholeheartedly agree. Ayn Rand, ever the consummate creative and marketer, said that objectivism is a philosophy for living on Earth. And she was so adamant about that point. If philosophy is not useful for you to live your life in reality, then it is not really philosophy. It is basically word games.
I feel like this is the main area of convergence here at this table, is that this is for real life, practical, everyday stuff. Objectivists, they do take a bit of issue, and Daniel can speak for himself on this, of course, with the question of common goods and whether or not such a thing exists. That which isn't good for the hive is not good for the bee. Epictetus's discourses, you're a citizen of the world. What is the job of a citizen? Act or never to act in his own interest. So is there a temperate or balanced way to think about this as a Stoic?
I mean, I think there is, just like now the Stoics probably paid lip service to this idea more than they did in practice. I mean, Marcus Aurelius believes he's a citizen of the world, and then, when Rome is invaded, he goes and puts down the rebellion in relatively brutal fashion, right? So again, I think practically some of these things are different than they are abstractly. But I do find it fascinating. I was thinking about it as I went for a run yesterday, and I got up to the top of the mountain, and I'm looking down on it. There's a passage where Marcus Aurelius talks about taking Plato's view, seeing the world from above, how interconnected and close together we are, how small some of the things we fight over are. Basically a pre-modern understanding of what we today call the overview effect that astronauts speak to. And you think how easily we say something like, let's take the 10,000 foot view on this. And it's like, what was the highest elevation that any of the Stoics ever actually got to? 10,000 feet would be pretty high for a citizen of the Roman Empire. I mean, I guess Hannibal crossed the Alps, but they were trying to get outside the immediacy of their own concerns, which I do think is important, and it is easy to lose track of. We can have different disagreements as to what our obligations are, what the common good is exactly, but I do think the idea that, ultimately somebody else being exploited or abused or a victim of an unjust system, I think there is a self-interested argument in the sense that, if it can happen to them, it can happen to you. And then I think there's also a sort of a moral degradation that comes along with being the kind of person that says, I don't care about that. And I think that's partly what the Stoics are saying, is that when you turn off these parts of yourself, which is, again, maybe what some people think Stoicism is, you are doing actually a harm to living a sort of a full and vibrant life.
So I think objectivists sometimes get a bad rap as being these super rugged individualists, damn everyone else, pull yourself up by your own bootstrings, never work together, loner type, right? And that's not really what the philosophy says at all. I mean, for goodness sake, therefore, laissez-faire capitalism. You can have laissez-faire capitalism where no one trades with anyone ever? Of course not. Objectivism says your life is your highest moral purpose. So you have to decide what your value hierarchy is and decide for yourself who you are going to interact with, in what way you're going to participate in civic society or not, right? Objectivism rejects the idea that you have a moral obligation to others in any meaningful way, right? We are not a collective. You are all individuals with individual minds and must live individual lives. And we can choose to work together. And in fact, we get massive, massive benefit from working together. And I don't know of any objectivist who has decided, no, I'm not going to work with anyone ever and just sit in the closet and read philosophy all day. That would be terrible. What an awful life you would build for yourself that way. But the point is, it has to be up to you. You have to make that moral determination about how you're going to interact with others in the world, save for you cannot harm them. You cannot take their stuff. Don't hurt people and don't take their stuff, as the kibbies would say, right? Like, those are your obligations to other people, is to let them be free to also make their own choices, to recognize their autonomy. And if we get together and we do things, whether it's the local parent-teacher association or Toastmasters or a government, it has to be a voluntary choice that we get together and do that.
I think I would agree with that. But one of the things I wanted to address in my talk is that sometimes I think there's this tendency in libertarian circles or philosophical circles where we go like, look, it should all be a choice, right? People should choose to do the right thing. They shouldn't be coerced. And then we don't actually create the framework through which we not just encourage, but explain why we should make the social versus the antisocial choices, the moral choice versus the immoral choice, and we can disagree over this term exactly, but I think it's like, yeah, people should be free to say whatever they want, Does that mean nothing? Everything is true, and we should treat all opinions equally? No, I don't think we should. There's actually a really interesting discussion. One of the Middle Stoics, I think it's Diogenes, might have been another one, but maybe it was Antipater, where he's talking about, okay, you're selling your house. So again, how modern some of these examples are. You're selling your house, and your house has a sanitation issue or has a plumbing issue. Like, today we would say, like, has an issue you have to disclose on your seller's disclosure form. Mm-hmm. And before the sort of government solution to this, he's saying, well, what should an individual do? Should you sell the house as though it's perfect and lie? Or should you take the hit to your financial self-interest and disclose that there's something wrong with this thing that you're selling? And so, maybe the libertarian view is like, no, people shouldn't be made to do this. They should just do the right thing because it's the right thing. And I think Antipater's point is like, you shouldn't lie about it because, down the road, someone will do it to you, and we all live in a society. It's some formulation of the golden rule. But I just think it seems naive to go like, no, people should just do the right thing because it's the right thing. And then I go, where is the history of people just doing the right thing in violation of their self-interest? This is where culture comes in, and this is where heroes come in, and values come in, and philosophy comes in. Mm-hmm. This is where parenting comes in. But we just sort of go, well, it's like people did this during the pandemic. They go like, well, if just everyone was in better shape and healthier, this wouldn't be a problem. And it's like, okay, that ship sailed a long time ago, though. Like, we're in the problem now. And so I think it can be sometimes easy to go, look, nothing should be coerced. People should just be trusted to make the right decision. And then when people sort of talk about what that looks like, that's all like, oh, we'll figure that out later.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of good stuff there. But what I would say is there are two things. So one is, it's not simply that you should, quote, just do the right thing because it's the right thing, right? Objectivism says doing the right thing it makes you have a flourishing life.
Yes.
It makes you happy. It gives you whatever. The point is you enact a virtue in order to get a value. Now, in the house situation, that's interesting, right? I just bought a house not that long ago and went through a lot of this process, and there's something really interesting about that example. The question of like, am I morally obligated to disclose this thing with the house? I think it partially depends on how serious it is.
Sure.
And if you know about it,
yes.
Right? Like there was stuff about my house that I didn't know about and stuff about the house we bought that we didn't know about. But also think about what obligation you have to yourself in that scenario. I would never go in and buy a house where they would not allow me to have a home inspection, where I could go in and verify that there's nothing wrong with this house. And that, to me, is what Objectivism says is your moral obligation, in fact, in that scenario. Yes, maybe you should tell the truth if you know about this thing, but trust but verify, right? Like, I am going to send in an inspector before I buy this house, and if they say no to that, well, I'm not buying your house, and now you have lost out on that opportunity to sell it to me. So was it in your self-interest to keep it from me in that scenario? Probably not, right?
In my head, there's a connection here. I hope this works for Ryan, but in your Daily Stoic videos, you talk a lot about coveting your time and being very controlling over that. No, I don't have time for a coffee or for you to bend to my ear and that kind of stuff. And there's like this obligation sort of thing going on where people reach out, like you have knowledge that could really help people, maybe write a book or open up a bookstore, but you have a primary focus, which is creating more stuff, keeping the Daily Stoic going, taking care of your kids and your farm, and you go, no, I'm not going to sit down with you. And some people will go, well, that's a little objectivist.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, it's a tension for sure. And this is why I like Aristotle's contention that, virtue sits in the midpoint between two vices, being totally selfish and never helping anyone, being so helpful and never that you end up neglecting other obligations or yourself. There's something right in the middle about sort of weighing your different responsibilities, and that I think is probably as close to it as you're going to reasonably get, and asking yourself, okay, what is my best use of my resources, and how do I best contribute to the common good, right? That every leader has to figure out, hey, there's some things you delegate, some things that are handled by certain types of people. Is this And so that is again a sort of practical thing that you figure out by experience. And when you have the ability to scale what you do, sometimes it's actually selfish to not scale those things and to do the inefficient thing, right? If the most basic law of economics is the law of comparative advantage, I think we have a certain obligation to do what we're good at, provided that is not sort of actively making the world a shitty
You're
place.
speaking the language of this room.
I am.
Comparative advantage, everybody. We love that.
By
We have
the way,
5 minutes left, so
Adam Smith's philosophy teacher is a translator of Epictetus, and I think if you read A Theory of Moral Sentiments, you get a sense that Adam Smith isn't this vicious, laissez-faire capitalist that he's sometimes made out to be, but a person who's saying, hey, this is how the world works. This is, a more efficient, this is probably the most efficient way to do things. And yet, as an individual, you have to decide how you're going to operate inside that system. And, his thing of the impartial observer sitting on your shoulder going, what would they think of this? Is sort of is actually a way of kind of approximating, transparency or, sort of a long-termism, I think, into the decisions you make. So
I just want to make a super quick response. And if you have your objectivist bingo cards out there, I'm going to give you a space here, which is I'm going to say that Ryan gave a false dichotomy. Objectivists love false dichotomies, right? We're obsessed with them. But, that distinction between being, quote, selfish and never helping anyone, or being totally selfless and not choosing to do other things, right? Like, I don't conflate selfishness with never helping anyone. Those things aren't connected to me. And I think we haven't really talked about the word selfishness yet in this, but Ayn Rand uses the word selfishness a lot. And what she means by that is long-term rational self-interest. Selfishness is just a more convenient word to use for that. But let me tell you, and you were described this perfectly, like, being truly selfish, like long-term rational self-interest, is actually really hard. As someone who's been an objectivist since I was in my 20s, I struggle with it all the time. I'm sure Ryan is actually much better at it than I am in terms of saying no to coffees or time sucks or things like that. I tend to be a little too selfless in that regard, right? Like, being truly selfish, consciously truly selfish, is hard. Making sure that you are always expressing your values and going by your value hierarchy is actually really hard. And so I know we're running out of time, so I'll give my short wrap up, and then Ryan can do so as well. For me, objectivism is a pro-life, pro-flourishing, pro-joy philosophy. It says you do have to accept the world as it is, but those are just materials from which you build a remarkable life. And to me, that's the major distinction between objectivism and stoicism. And if you'd like to learn more about it, you should go to prometheusfdn.org, prometheusfdn.org/freedomfest, where I've set up some convenient stuff for you guys to look at.
A pro-life, pro-flourishing, what was the last
Pro-joy.
Pro-joy? I mean, I think you could define stoicism on similar terms. I would add in there, it's about resiliency. It's about sort of freedom from what the Stoics would call externals, meaning that you could be indifferent to the circumstances that you happen to be in, meaning you can deal with what life throws at you. But in the end, I think that's what we're all after, right? And I think this is the distinction between with these schools and then many of the other schools, where it doesn't seem to be for life at all. It doesn't seem to be for people at all. It seems to be it seems to be a morass of confusion. I think Foucault compared some philosophers to fencing in the mirror. And I think that is unfortunately why, most people have zero interest in philosophy. And I think anyone that makes philosophy practical and accessible, gives people things to think about, to apply to their actual lives, is moving us in a positive direction.
Philosophy for living, breathing people. We love that. Ryan, Daniel, thank you so much.
Thank you all very much.